you would pray with me. Father, we want to thank you for your presence here with us this morning. Thank you that you know us and you love us. And help us to grasp what that means to trust you for every day. Help us just to be conscious of your presence. Help us to be aware, Lord, of your mercy, and be quick to identify the things in our life that don't honor you, and that we might find our confession before you and find your forgiveness. Lord, you know the weaknesses of our flesh, the weaknesses of our person. Your book tells us that Jesus was tempted in every way that we are, and yet he did not yield. And help us, Lord, to follow that model in our lives. But today, as we consider the story in your book, the story of Queen Esther, that you would open our hearts and minds to understand and comprehend and to find the application for our own hearts and lives. And so we give this day to you and look forward to what you're going to do in our lives. And we come in Jesus. Amen. All right. Well, I've given you notes to follow with me. I have. There are 10 chapters in Esther, and I've taken excerpts all the way throughout the whole book to highlight the story, the theme line, but we'll be looking at that. But I had a question I wanted to ask you that. In my research on Esther, and the book of Esther, I discovered there was something significant in that. And there is a day that is celebrated around the world, and it happened this past Friday. Do you know what that day was?
The Ides of March.
What?
The Ides of March.
The Ides of March? Could have been. I didn't even consider that, but you know, it's something in March. What day is that? I know St. Patrick's Day is the 17th. That's Monday, so it wasn't St. Patrick's Day. What else happens in March? Purim. Now, what is Purim? That I didn't know. You know, I read in the text that in the book of Esther is a reference to Purim, P-U-R-I-M. And I said, so what's that? So I did a web search on Purim and discovered that it's a celebration that the Jews have every year, and it's related to Queen Esther. And it happens every year on the same day. They celebrate March 14th. And I'm here sitting at my computer on Friday doing research, and I'm going, that's today. I said, what timely they would choose Esther to be the one we're going to talk about this morning. But that was just a day in which the Jews around the world for 2,500 years now have remembered and honored Queen Esther. And we're going to read and learn about her story today. And the setting for the book of Esther is in Persia, which is present-day Iran. And the date was 473 BC, almost 500 years before Jesus was born. Okay? And the king of Persia had made a decree to annihilate all the Jews living in the land. They had been taken as prisoners by Babylon and scattered across Persia. The Jewish people were. Remember that there were a number of countries, Assyria from the north of Israel, and Egypt from the south of Israel, and then Babylon came and conquered all of them and conquered Israel and took all the people of Judah, the people living in the vicinity of Jerusalem, took them into slavery back into Babylon. And then Persia, which is just to the east of Babylon, raised in power as a country, and they conquered Babylon. And when they did, Cyrus was the king, and he let the Jews go back. But not all the Jews came back at that time, and some scattered across the Persian Empire. And some ended up in the capital city and that's where the story of Esther takes place, in the city of Susa in present-day Iran, which would be in the southwest corner of the country. So, at the risk of her life, Queen Esther revealed her identity as a Jew and requested the king's mercy on her people. And the king consented. God protected the people of Israel once more. That's the story. And for 2,500 years, the Jews have celebrated this event on March 13 and 14. And you'll see why. As the days of Purim. And you'll understand why they call it Purim in a minute. We'll understand this celebration more as we look into the story of Esther. And we're going to do that today. Esther's family was Jewish and was taken from Jerusalem as prisoners to Babylon. When Babylon conquered the land, Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon at the time, and they took all the Jews back up, thousands of the Jews back to Babylon. And when Esther's parents died, her cousin, Mordecai, took her into his family, because she had no other family. When Persia conquered Babylon, Mordecai's family and Esther were among the Jews that went to Susa. So that kind of gives you a context of what happened there. I'm getting a little ring on the speaker here just a bit. King Xerxes was the ruler of the Persian kingdom at the time, and Persia extended all the way from, which would be Kabul, Afghanistan. In the text it says from India to Egypt. The whole region was under the authority of the Persian king. And Xerxes, the king, decided he wanted to celebrate his fame. He didn't conquer all that land. His grandfather did, Cyrus II. But nonetheless, Xerxes was the ruler, and that was all his land. So he decided that the whole kingdom would celebrate his rule for 6 months. And a banquet would ordered, had a banquet, and he ordered his queen, Vashti, to come and dance, wearing only her crown, just to show off her beauty to all of his guests. And she refused. And so he vanquished her, removed her as queen, and sent her away. And so in the text, we're going to look at chapter 2. It's in your notes that are there. Chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. And this is the story. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let the search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. And let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. That's from the text in Esther. So Esther was one of the young women that was taken to the king's palace. And she won Haggai's favor. She was gracious, respectful, a kind person, and the man in charge of the harem liked her a lot, and he recommended her to the king. So that's kind of the story. I'm going to give you, paraphrase some of it, because we'd be here all day going through, well, not all day, but a couple hours. Anyway, so in chapter 2, verse 17, it says, "Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." So that's not the most adorable thing that we want to say, or attractive thing about that story, but here she is. She's chosen out of all of the vast land from India to Egypt is the most beautiful, attractive young lady, and she's going to be the queen. But we find that Queen Esther is not just a body, but she is a person of a character, a person of strong belief and confidence in God, and just proved herself to stand out as a person. And Mordecai, her cousin who took her in, would sit outside the king's gate and would keep track of Esther. I mean, she's now in his harem, and she just wants to make sure that she's going to be okay. But while at the gate, Mordecai overheard the king's officers plotting to kill the king. And so Mordecai told Esther, who in turn told the king, while giving Mordecai credit for the report. And the court scribe recorded that report in the record of the country. And the officers who had plotted to kill the king were executed. But the king's life was spared because of Mordecai's warning that came through Queen Esther. And so that even gained greater respect on the part of the king toward Esther. And then the next thing the story talks about is an official in the court of King Xerxes was named Haman. And he was a proud man without respect for anybody else. And for some reason, and I couldn't identify that, the king chose to honor Haman with recognition above all the nobles and ordered all of them to kneel before Haman whenever he was present. Everyone did that except Mordecai. And we don't have an explanation in the scripture. We can guess why he maybe didn't. But Mordecai, being a Jew, would not have been respected by Haman, for one. But in this situation, because Mordecai didn't bow, Haman became enraged, and Haman sought to kill Mordecai, and not only Mordecai, but all the Jewish people throughout the whole land from India to Egypt. And this is what Haman did. We find this in chapter 3, verse 8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people, and who do not obey the king's laws," like kneel down and bow before me. That was his issue. "It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I personally will put up 10,000 talents of silver." Now, what's a talent? A talent is 75 pounds of something. So I didn't figure this out. What's 10,000 times 75 pounds? That's how much money he put up, value he put up. So Haman said, "I will put up 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business, who go about and kill. I'll hire the army who will go out and kill all the Jews." And the king said, "Keep the money and do with the people as you please." And so a decree went out throughout all the land that on a day given in the future, all the Jews would be killed. And to determine the day, Haman decided, he decided what day the Jews would be annihilated by rolling dice, or as the text says, casting purs. A pur was a die, like dice, rolling dice. And so he rolled dice to determine what day of the year the Jews would be killed. And it fell on, in our calendar, March 13. And that's why it's called Purim, because the destruction ordered on the Jews fell on March 13th. And they celebrate the day on the 14th because of something that significantly happened on the 14th. So here's the order. In 1 year from that date, all the Jews would be killed on March 13th. Mordecai sent a message to Esther and urged her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So here's Esther, who's been made queen. And now all of the Jews are ordered to be killed in a year. And Mordecai says, the only voice I got is the queen. Queen Esther, go to the king and plead mercy for your people. And Esther responded to Mordecai. We find this in chapter 4, verse 11. Esther said, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. So you don't go before the king and make a request. That's what she's telling Mordecai. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the golden scepter to him and spare his life. And he's got this golden staff, and he can, if he points it to you, you can enter and make your request or have conversation with the king. Well, Mordecai responded to Esther, who Esther's saying, I can't do that. And Mordecai responded with the hope that a sovereign God would protect her and continue to protect the Jews. And he challenged Esther with these words, and we find these in chapter 4, verse 13. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. He says, Esther, keep in mind, you're Jewish, and that's going to be known. And the law of the land says you're going to get killed too. Just want you to be conscious of that. Mordecai makes that statement. He says, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise, but from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this. And Mordecai is just saying, God's going to deliver the Jews because that's his promise. And it may very well be by God's sovereign decree that you're the queen and be the one who's going to be the spokesman that saves the Jews. That's what he's saying to her. And so you see in Mordecai's posture, in his belief system, God had protected the Jews from time and time again from all of the enemies that had come against Israel. And he's going to do it again because he promised to. So in Esther chapter 4, verse 15, it says, then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, and even though it is against the law, if I perish, I perish. I've come to the conclusion I will do what I need to do, whatever the end result. So in chapter 5, verse 1, on the third day, after everybody fasted, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. He was in a generous mood that day. Well, Esther requested that the king and Haman, interesting, the one who put the decree together under the king's authority, Esther requested that the king and Haman both come to a banquet she had prepared that day. The king agreed. And at the banquet, the king asked Esther, what is your request? And she said, I would like to have another banquet tomorrow that both you and Haman can come to. And the king agreed. So they had a banquet, and the next day they were going to have another banquet. So in the meantime, several things happened from one day to the next. Haman went home that night, all excited about another banquet where he was to be honored, because he was the only one invited apart from the king. And so he felt that he was the one being honored in all of this. But when he went home, he was excited about being honored, but he expressed his resentment against Mordecai because the guy who sits at the king's gate won't bow to me. And he's Jewish. His wife and friends said, well, build a gallows, a hanging platform, 75 feet tall, and ask the king to hang Mordecai in the morning. Then you can go to the banquet happy. See, that was in the text. That's what was said. Now, another thing happened. That night, King Xerxes had trouble sleeping. So he asked the court recorder to read the record from the court. And in the reading of that, there was the record of Mordecai warning him about the plot to kill him. In the morning, and so it reminded him of that, and he said, I need to do something to honor Mordecai. So in the morning, Haman was about to ask for Mordecai's hanging, when the king said, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? And Haman, thinking that a king was referring to him, laid out a course that he would like to be honored by. So in chapter 6, verse 7, it says, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes, thinking of himself. Let them robe the man with king delights, the man the king delights to honor, and lead on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. That's what Haman thought ought to be done. And so the king said, go at once, Haman, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. You get the picture? Here's Haman, all excited about being honored at 2 banquets, and has arranged a hanging for Mordecai, and only come to find out before he can ask that Mordecai be hanged, the king wants to honor Mordecai with all this royal treatment that Haman thought was coming to him. So Haman did as he was told, but with great resentment. And at the banquet that day, the king asked Esther once again, what's your request? And in chapter 7, verse 3, the Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? And in verse 6, Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is this vile Haman, sitting here with us. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, he said, I'm a dead man now. He stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Well, Haman was hung that day on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. Somewhere in that you see justice. Somewhere in that you see the people of God protected again. In chapter 8, verse 1, That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the one who could the one who could give 75 talents. I don't know, how many talents was it there? How many was that, did we say? 10,000 talents. So it was a wealthy guy. And the king gave the estate of Haman to the queen. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. Now this signet ring, you could write a decree and seal it with this ring in the place of the king. The king's authority goes with that ring, and the king gave that to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him, Mordecai, over the estate of Haman. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman, which he had devised against the Jews. Haman's dead, but the decree still stands that the Jews on March 13 are all going to be slaughtered. And all these armies have been paid for to go do that. And so she begged him, the king, to put an end to that plan. Then the king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and she rose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people?" She's now identified herself with the Jews. The king didn't know this. You know, when he made her queen, he didn't know she was Jewish. But when she went and made her request, she revealed that she was a Jew. And so she's coming now. She's saying, that decree still stands up there. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you. So the king said, "Esther, you write the decree that you think is appropriate. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked." So we've got this decree out there to kill all of the Jews on March 13. And now the queen and Mordecai, who has the ring, can write another decree. And they do. In chapter 8, verse 11, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. So they wrote a second decree that allowed the Jews to gather and protect themselves, which they couldn't do before. So the edict defined March 13 is the day in which the Jews can defend themselves, the same day that the order was out to kill them. Well, when the 13th day arrived to destroy the Jewish people, this is my notes to you here. On the 13th day, when that day arrived, the Jews fought back and defeated all their enemies. And the text said 75,000 people out to kill the Jews died that day. The next day, the 14th, the Jews rested and made it a day of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So you see now why the celebration of Purim, the rolling of dice that decided a day of disaster, the 13th. The next day was a day of rejoicing and celebration, and mandated by Mordecai and sealed with the king's ring. that from then on, March 14th, would be a day of celebration of God's victory, protecting of his people, and the destruction of an evil plot and plan. That's kind of the summary of the book of Esther. And I said, what can I learn from this? Well, one, the decree was made 2,500 years ago that every generation would remember this day. And when I did my search on Purim, I found a news article published by the Jewish News, which is the legal news service of Israel, said this in Jewish News. It reported that last Friday, March 14th, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu participated in the traditional reading of the book of Esther during the holiday of Purim. The Prime Minister of Israel today had read on the 13th, that evening after sunset, had read the story of Esther and then addressed a group of people concerning Purim. And I'm going, is that pretty phenomenal that 2,500 years later, this incident that we're reading about today would be remembered? A day in which God protected the Jewish people, as he promised. And I find it also interesting that Netanyahu drew a comparison of the story of Purim and Queen Esther to the modern-day Israeli conflict with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I thought on that, and I remember in a time in the past I did a lot of research on prophecy in the scripture. What's there? And the thing that really stood out to me as I saw a map, a global map, highlighting the Mediterranean and Europe and all of Russia, and coming down, and all of the Stan countries, and you got down to India, and you got Jordan and Lebanon, and you got Egypt to the south, and you got this little sliver of land called Israel, 175 miles long and like 50 miles wide. Just a little sliver of land. A land that God gave to Abraham and his ancestors. And all of these years, and most recent years, outnumbered, outrageous number of Arabs surrounding this country, and yet it still exists. It tells me something about the sovereign control of God in the world he created, and his sovereignty in protecting the land of Israel and the Jewish people. Knowing that here they were conquered by Egypt, they were conquered by Babylon. Babylon was conquered by Persia. The prophet Isaiah, 130 years before Cyrus, the king of Persia, was born, Isaiah predicted that Cyrus would be the one who releases the Jews to return to the land. And that happened. And is there something about the sovereignty of God that I can rest in? I can trust in. And this story of Esther is a story of God's sovereignty. And it's also the story of a person of courage and trust in God. If I perish, I perish. I'm going to do what I must do, was her words. And so can I live my life with that kind of confidence in God? That I can lay my life on the line and do what he asked me to do. And do I have any reason to believe he will not do what he promises to do? I was reminded of the story of the three buddies of Daniel. They were in Babylon at the time, and they wouldn't yield to the king. Nebuchadnezzar, the royal king of Babylon. And they were going to be thrown into a furnace, a large furnace burning so hot that it scorched the people, standing on the outside. So, and they were going to throw these 3 guys in the furnace, and they just said, God will deliver us. And if he doesn't deliver us, we're still not going to bow to the king. And they threw them into the furnace, and they came out. They didn't even smell like smoke. Their hair wasn't even singed. And I said, God delivered them. And in the same sense here, the story of Esther, she put her life on the line, identifying herself as a Jew and going before the king. And so I can not only trust in God's sovereignty in this world and in my life, but I can walk in confidence and do what he says, with the confidence that he's going to be with me in what he calls me to be about and what to do. I have no reason to fear. And the other thought that is in this is that I am never alone. He's always with me. I just said there's a confidence that comes when we can rest in that. And the Jews in the day of Esther were charged to remember the character of God and his faithfulness to his promises. And the Jews to this day do. And to this day, in spite of all that's going on in the world today and how it's reported in the news as to who's responsible for what do you do when someone comes across the line and kills 1,200 people? Have they not a right to retaliate, to remove that threat from them? And then there's others who can come and say, well, Israel deserved it because of their mistreatment of the Palestinians. Well, what is mistreatment of the Palestinians? For years before Arafat came on the scene, the Palestinians and the Jews lived together in that land, and there was not an issue until somebody made an issue out of being Palestinian or being Israeli. Well, history is significant, and we have much that we can learn here from Esther. And we do know that God will expose injustice and evil intent, and that he will execute justice. And he did with Haman, who plotted to do away with the Jews. And we also see that God's faithfulness to his promises to the people of Israel are trustworthy. I thought of a passage in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23. Let us hold fast unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And you can trust God. So you're in life, you've got a whole life ahead of you. And you got decisions you're making and what's going to happen. Well, I don't know, and I see what happens to some people. Is that going to happen to me? I need to take control. I need to be in charge of this. I need to make things happen. And it's not bad to be responsible. But somewhere in that, can I act out of my life with faith and trust that God's got me? God will open doors. God will protect my back. He'll watch over me when I'm not, I can't control everything. But there's a posture that we can take. I'm going to be in charge, I'm going to be in control, and you can manipulate things in your life to be in that kind of posture and never have peace. Because the peace, it comes in your trust in the Lord. And he's faithful. And he's promised, I will never leave you or forsake you. I will uphold you with my right hand. You are mine. And we are his through faith in his Son Jesus and his death on the cross on our behalf. It's just that simple. yet for some reason that difficult, because we have this deep, intent, inferior, scary attitude that just says, I gotta be in charge. I gotta protect myself. And I said, it's good to be responsible, but let it rest in God and trust in Him. And you can do that. We can do that. We can trust God with our lives each and every moment. He knows us. He loves us. He is merciful. He is caring. And He is present. We want the kind of trust that is expressed by Esther. And this is trust, confidence, and submission to God that she demonstrated. And we can do the same and learn from her. I think if you have an opportunity sometime, next time I'm with you, I think I'm going to pick Daniel as the one we look at. Only because Daniel was a prophet in Babylon during, just prior to all of this. And the story of Esther. And I thought that may give us some more insight from what we learned today. I hope that was helpful to you. You think of the things in your life that are struggles today. Can you do as Esther? Skip meals for a day and spend the day thinking about God and His faithfulness and just pour out your heart to Him. Trust Him. And watch Him perform what He does. God's granted a lot of years to Carla and I. We have a lot of stories we can tell. You've heard some of them. But God has been faithful. Because that's all He can be. That's who He is.